what is techno-feudalism?
It sounds absurd to hear somebody like me saying that capitalism is finished, because wherever you look, what you see is the triumph of capital over labor, over politics, a wholesale capitalist triumph. And yet here I am saying that capitalism is already gone. So to be specific here, what do I mean by capitalism? What do we mean by capitalism? It's not markets. The idea that capitalism is a system of markets is very, very weak, and it doesn't really capture what capitalism was supposed to be about. Capitalism was supposed to be the economic system that followed from the great transformation of feudalism, that shifted power from the owners of land to the owners of machinery, of capital, of produced means of production, and also channeled all economic activity through markets. That's where markets come in. So labor markets, real estate markets, which didn't exist under feudalism. So profit takes over from ground rent, and markets engulf the whole of economic activity. That, in my view, is already on the way out, if not dead and buried already. Since 2008, we had two major events, outcomes, flowing out of the disaster, the financial sector disaster in 2008. The first one you already mentioned. What did the great and the good do after the great crash of 2008? They got together under, if you remember, the auspices of Gordon Brown in London in April 2009, and the G7 and the G20 decided to coordinate their money printing, central bank money printing capacity. They printed around $35 trillion.
What we would call quantitative easing these days.
Quantitative easing, yes, that's a nice polite term. They printed huge quantities of money, I mean, torrents of cash, which they gave to the financial sector to deflate it. And at the same time, every single one of them, whether they admitted to it or not, doesn't matter, practiced quite harsh austerity, fiscal austerity. So you have this amazing combination. On the one hand, you have the greatest liquidity in the financial circuits of financial capital in the history of capitalism, huge liquidity, and at the same time, very low levels of demand for investment. Because when you practice austerity, aggregate demand crashes. Even if you give money to big business, they're not going to invest, because they look at the masses, and they say, well, they can't afford to buy expensive products from us, so we're not going to invest. So they take the available liquidity, and usually what they mostly did with it was to pump it back into the financial sector to buy back their own shares, for instance. And therefore you had asset price inflation and price deflation at the same time. The only serious investment that took place between 2009 and today, and 2023, let's say, was in what I call cloud capital, in big tech, algorithmic machinery from optic fibers, server farms, and so on, the Silicon Valley stuff. But not only Silicon Valley, but also the equivalent in China, because you have these two big techs. You have an American big tech and a Chinese big tech. And why is this relevant to what I was saying before about capitalism and being replaced or killed off? Well, if my hypothesis is right in my book, that profits have been replaced, on the one hand, by state money, the quantitative easing that you mentioned, and by the massive rents retained by big tech. So every time you buy something of Amazon.com, anything between 20 and 40% of the price is skimmed off by Jeff Bezos from the capitalist who actually sells whatever it is that you're buying, electric bicycle, exercise bike, binoculars, books, whatever. Everything you sell is charged a huge amount of what is equivalent to ground rent in feudal terms. I call it cloud rent, because it is the money that vassal capitalists have to pay to big tech to gain access to you. And add to this the remarkable reinforcement mechanism, machine learning, AI-driven algorithms, which, take Alexa or Siri or any of these interfaces. What these things do, I mean, they are pieces of capital, right? But they are not capital like steam engines or indeed industrial robots, because they're not produced means of production. They have produced means of behavioral modification that has never existed before in the history of capitalism. So we train Alexa to train us, to train it, to train us, to know us well enough, to give us fantastic advice which I personally follow, because when it recommends a book, I usually want to read it, okay? And then not only does it actually do the job of the advertiser, of Don Draper in Mad Men, if you've ever watched that great series, right? But it also, so it's an automated capital version of Don Draper. But unlike Don Draper and all the great advertisers, such and so on, who were very good at implanting in your head ideas of what you wanted to buy, such and Don Draper could not sell it to you. You had to go to the shops to get it. Well, now the same algorithm sells it to you. It arrives on your doorstep, bypassing markets, because Amazon.com is not a market.
So you're kind of describing, we had the 2008 crisis, huge amounts of money flood into the system and heading into the direction of particularly large tech companies in both the US and China. And so now it's an economic system that, as you say, isn't being driven by profits, but is instead being driven by rent. But just take that one step further. It sounds bad, but I could just explain why it's bad for me or, the person, my neighbor, like why that change in system, which we may not really perceive has happened, is actually bad for us.
Look, I'm not making a moral case. I'm not moralizing. I'm not saying this is bad because, Jeff Bezos is getting rich and people. No, what I'm saying is this. The economy that we live in, when a large amount of profit turns into rent or is skimmed off by rentiers, that economic energy, think of it as economic energy, is taken out of the circular flow of income. Because when Jeff Bezos gains another 10 billion through the practices of Amazon.com, he has absolutely no reason to invest it into the economy that your neighbors are participating in. Let me give you a very simple numerical example. Take General Motors or Volkswagen or British Aerospace, one of the traditional capitalist firms. They more or less, it's interesting that more or less spend about the same proportion of their revenues on wages. It's about 85%. All the large corporations, traditional corporations, capitalist corporations, of every 100 pounds that they extract from the market, they pay 85 in wages. And that money, that 85 pounds, circulates in the economy. Do you know what the percentage is that Mr. Zuckerberg pays his employees in Meta? Less than 1% goes to workers. So that money, again, this is not a moral point I'm making. It's a factual point. It's a point that this money is extracted from the circular flow of income. And that issue, what that does is it forces central banks to keep printing, even today, through various ways, in order to replenish the lost economic activity, energy. So even though now we've moved from deflation to inflation, a serious cost of living crisis, central banks, even though they want to diminish the amount of money printing they do, they are stopped from doing that because the more cloud rent is extracted from the economy due to this transition from what I call from capitalism to what I call techno-capitalism, techno-feudalism, right? This essentially makes the job of central bankers impossible. Governments are fiscally stressed, so there is nothing they can do about it. And in the meantime, you have the depreciation of the quality of jobs that people do with the shift of employment to a kind of techno-feudal environment. Think of people working for Uber, for Deliveroo, for Amazon's warehouses, precariously employed labor, which cannot make plans for future expenditure on houses, on durables. So the whole system becomes much more prone to crisis. And that is something that your neighbor should care about.
Yeah, I want to absolutely come back to this point about the impact it has on today's current inflation crisis. But one other just kind of big, broader question is, does this system only work if we are somewhat beholden to kind of these devices, whether it's Alexa, Siri, and these companies? I mean, we tend to use them for what feels like quite trivial things these days. You describe them as us training them and they train us, but it's when you look at what people ask these things, it's like, what is the weather? What's your recipe for this thing? What's the sports score? In what ways do you feel like we are or aren't actually beholden to these these devices, these companies, the ability to actually move away from them should we choose? Is it that because you have this kind of idea of a new serfdom in your book?
Look, I'm not prone to, again, as I said, moralizing. I don't like to tell people, oh, you naughty boy or girl, you should not be addicted to the machine. I'm addicted to the machine. These machines are extremely useful. I find them, in my research, in my studying, in my enjoyment of life, listening to music. Spotify is a great source of joy for me. Suddenly I can listen to any song that I remember from my childhood. And suddenly I can listen to it. I'm never going to turn against the users of these apps and these platforms. But I need to focus on the fact that these algorithms, which could be perfectly useful and perfectly benign, because they are owned by very, very few people whose job is to maximize cloud rent extraction, these algorithms are written in order to be addictive. And to be addictive in a way which is quite pernicious for the psyche of our people, and especially younger people. So I don't blame people for using them. I'm not a Luddite. I do not believe, even though I shouldn't say that because Luddites were very misunderstood and they were quite wonderful activists in their time, and they've been given a very bad press. But you know what I mean? I'm not anti-technology. I'm not saying that we should go back to the cave. There's no doubt that if you want to escape techno-feudalism, you get rid of your smartphone, you get an old Nokia, you use cash all the time, you never go online. But that is not the solution. It is like saying, imagine if this was the 1770s when Adam Smith was writing his tome about the wealth of nations and the transition of feudalism to capitalism. Imagine if we were saying, okay, well, this is not a very good development, so let's abandon machinery and let's go back to hammers and sickles.